Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something pretty thorny, a real philosophical puzzle, actually, one that sort of defined a lot of ethical debate in the 20th century. Our mission, if you will, is to dive headfirst into Simone de Beauvoir's defense of the Marquis de Sade. Yeah, you heard that right. I mean, it's a defense that's so radical, so, well, provocative. It really forces you to step back and rethink everything you thought you knew about freedom and ethics. Because here we have Simone de Beauvoir, the giant of French existentialism, the person who gave us the ethics of ambiguity, who championed reciprocal freedom, looking out for the other. And she's arguing quite fiercely that Sade, yes, that's Sade, the name we associate with, let's be honest, calculated cruelty, utter depravity, heroes who are just monstrous tyrants, that he's actually, and this is her phrase, a great moralist, and even more incredibly, an ethical model. How on earth do those two things fit together? It seems completely contradictory.
Well, that contradiction, that paradox, that's exactly what makes this so fascinating. And it's really the engine driving our deep dive today. If you look at Beauvoir's standard ethical framework, the one she's famous for, it's built on this really core principle. To be authentically moral, you have to recognize that your own freedom depends entirely on the freedom of other people. Our moral job, essentially, is to promote that shared freedom, that interdependency. That's Beauvoir 101, right?
Right. Mutual recognition, shared projects.
Exactly. But then you throw Sade into the mix, and his whole philosophical universe, the world his, cold-blooded libertine heroes live in, it's built on what Beauvoir herself calls isolatism. Yeah. Which is just this ruthless, purely mental pursuit of one's own pleasure that completely throws out any idea of shared existence or reciprocity or, frankly, feeling anything mutual at all. It looks like the exact opposite of ethics, like a blueprint for destroying it.
So, yeah, on the face of it, it looks like Beauvoir is defending the very thing that goes against her most fundamental beliefs. Why? Why spend so much intellectual energy trying to, redeem or at least explain a figure whose work seems to just violently trash every ethical idea she built her career on? What could she possibly get from Sade?
That's the crucial question. What she gets, I think, are the edges, the boundaries of her own philosophy. Beauvoir, quite brilliantly, uses Sade's profound literary failure. And she does see it as a failure at achieving its stated goals.
Okay.
She uses that failure to actually reveal the necessary conditions, the sort of ontological bedrock for freedom, for morality, for desire itself.
Yep.
So what we're going to do is unpack how she takes Sade's absolute rejection of the other, his deliberate avoidance of ambiguity, and uses that to build this really powerful, almost necessary supplement and a corrective, actually, to her earlier monumental work, The Second Sex.
A corrective to The Second Sex. How?
Yeah, it's fascinating. Sade becomes this kind of negative proof. He's the demoniac moralist who, by pushing human possibility to its absolute destructive limit, kind of accidentally proves why we need a truly reciprocal, authentic ethics based on recognizing the other.
Wow. Okay, so he's like the test case pushed to the extreme, the intellectual sacrifice needed to make her own system stronger. Okay, I think I'm starting to see the shape of it. Let's lay down that groundwork first. Okay, right. Let's take this step by step. Before we can really grasp how Sade functions as this corrective element, we need a solid handle on Beauvoir's standard ethical framework, the one primarily laid out in the Ethics of Ambiguity from 47. The very framework Sade's heroes seem hell-bent on destroying.
Exactly. The absolute foundation of her ethics is confronting what she calls the fundamental ambiguity of the human condition. It's this idea that we're not just objects in the world like rocks or chairs, but we're not pure spirit or pure mind either. We're this constant tension between what she calls transcendence, our ability to project ourselves into the future, to make choices in flesh, our immanence, the fact that we're stuck in a body in a specific situation with a history. We are freedom, yes, but it's always a situated freedom.
We're caught in the middle, essentially.
Precisely. And so for Beauvoir, adopting an authentic moral attitude means embracing this dual reality. And crucially, it means realizing that my own project of being free, my transcendence, it actually depends entirely on you recognizing me as free and on my committing to your freedom in return. If I try to deny your subjectivity, if I treat you just as an object for my own use, like the Sadean hero does, I'm actually undermining the very condition, the existence of other free beings that makes my own freedom meaningful in the first place. That's when she says you fall into the spirit of seriousness, pretending things have fixed objective value instead of acknowledging we create value through choice.
Okay, I get that. And the Sadean hero, he just obliterates this ambiguity, doesn't he? By being so hyper-rational, so ruthlessly logical, and focusing only on his own pleasure, his own isolated consciousness.
Absolutely. That's the core of what she calls isolatism. And it's more than just being selfish. It's a deliberate philosophical choice. The libertine takes Cartesianism, I think, therefore I am, and pushes it to this radical, almost solipsistic extreme. I think, therefore I am absolute. He tries to make his entire being reside in pure consciousness, rejecting the messy ambiguity of his own body, rejecting the shared world of feelings, and this very clarity of thought, this philosophical justification for his cruelty that becomes the source of his pleasure, his aphrodisiac.
So the more he can rationalize the cruelty, the better it feels. But in doing that, by shutting out ambiguity and trying to reduce everything, including other people, to just extensions of his own mind, he actually prevents himself from ever truly connecting with the other. Is that right?
That's exactly it. He can dominate, he can control, he can destroy, but he can't attain the other in any meaningful, reciprocal way. And for Beauvoir, this inevitably leads straight to tyranny and exploitation. It's an inherently unethical project because it's founded on denying the freedom of others, which, as we said, is the foundation for one's own freedom.
And this connects back, you mentioned, to the problem she diagnosed earlier in The Second Sex, that this whole ethical problem has roots in a fundamental gender imbalance.
Yes, precisely. The need for a figure like Sade, paradoxically, to sort of shake things up, is tied to this profound asymmetry she laid out so devastatingly in The Second Sex, published just a couple of years later in 1949. And Sade, weirdly, helps to expose and maybe even undermine that asymmetry.
Right, that foundational imbalance is just crushing when you read it. The Second Sex basically argues that throughout history, man has set himself up as the default human, the transcendental subject.
Yes, the norm.
He's the mind, the agent, the one who acts on the world. He's self-sufficient, confident in his body and his freedom.
While woman is systematically pushed into the position of immanence. She's defined in relation to man. She becomes the absolute other. She's tied to her biology, her reproductive role, defined by her situation rather than her projects.
And her body isn't experienced as a tool for engaging with the world, but often as a burden, right? Something mysterious, maybe even shameful, something that needs to be managed, often for the benefit of men or society.
Exactly. It's a source of vulnerability, not power, in that traditional framework.
And the consequence of this huge structural imbalance is that genuine mutual desire and love become incredibly fraught, maybe even impossible to sustain on equal terms. The woman is always positioned as in danger, needing the man's recognition, his transcendence, to sort of validate her existence or freedom.
While the man remains, at least culturally, positioned as sufficient unto himself, the woman is necessary to him, but as the other, something to be possessed or defined, not an equal partner in freedom.
Okay, so we have this ethical framework needing reciprocity, and the social framework where reciprocity between sexes is structurally undermined.
And this structural mess leads directly to the absence, in Sade's universe, of something Beauvoir considers absolutely essential for genuine human connection, especially erotic connection.
Yeah.
The concept she calls le trouble.
Ah, yes, le trouble. It's often translated as emotional intoxication or disturbance, but it feels like more than that. We should probably unpack this because you said its absence is key to understanding Sade's violence.
It absolutely is. Le trouble is that profound. Or disturbance is a good word. That sudden confusion, that sense of being thrown off balance, the agitation that comes with sexual desire. It's the body taking over, the blush, the dizziness, the racing heart when you're confronted by the person you desire. Beauvoir sees le trouble as the actual origin point of authentic sexual desire. It's not just a byproduct, it's the source.
And why is it so important philosophically? What makes it more than just, feeling flustered?
Because in that moment of le trouble, your existence is grasped in this unique way. Simultaneously as active subjectivity I desire and as passive overwhelm I am overcome. You're both acting and being acted upon by your own body, by the presence of the other. This, she argues, creates an ambiguous unity. It's a fleeting moment where the usual boundaries between self and other blur, where the partners momentarily merge. You're delivered from your constant self-awareness, your isolated self-presence, and you achieve this immediate, almost pre-rational, authentic communication through the flesh.
Okay, so it's the body's way of short-circuiting the isolating mind.
Exactly. But the Sadean hero, trapped in his hyper-rational isolatism, is completely cut off from this. He's constitutionally incapable of feeling the trouble, that spontaneous vertigo. The mere ambiguous presence of another person's body doesn't move him internally.
So his violence, his ferocity.
It stems directly from this lack, Beauvoir argues. Because he can't be moved by passive desire, because he doesn't experience that internal spontaneous connection, he has to act aggressively. He has to force a sensation, substitute brutal action and cerebral calculation for that sensual surrender he can't achieve.
Wow. So Sade's world isn't populated by hypersexual beings overflowing with desire, but by existentially frustrated minds. Minds desperately trying to force a connection, trying to hack their way back to the body and the other through extreme measures because the natural bridge is broken.
That's a great way to put it. It's the triumph of the intellect, trying desperately and violently to reclaim the very bodily connection it is philosophically denied. And this leads us straight into the central, mind-bending paradox of Beauvoir's essay. She argues that Sade's extreme cruelty isn't just, meaningless, nihilistic depravity. She sees it as a kind of failed philosophical experiment.
Failed.
Yes, failed in its ultimate aim. But in its very failure, it accidentally proves the ontological conditions that are necessary for any kind of ethics, any kind of connection, to even exist.
Okay, unpack that, because even within this philosophy of total isolation, his need for cruelty, often highly ritualized cruelty, seems to immediately reveal a fundamental dependency on the victim. He claims to want to annihilate them, but why does the victim have to suffer in such specific ways?
That's the crucial point. The Sadean tyrant, the debauched libertine, must, on some level, presuppose that his victim is enough like him, retains enough subjectivity, enough free will to actually experience the pain and pleasure he's inflicting. Beauvoir is very clear on this. The libertine gets no real satisfaction from torturing a mere object, like a doll or even a corpse. If the victim was just an inanimate thing, feeling nothing, the acts wouldn't just be cruel, it would be, existentially empty for the torturer himself.
Okay, that's the logical linchpin then. The victim has to remain, in some sense, a free subject capable of authentic suffering for the tyrant's whole project to have any philosophical weight for him.
Exactly. And since that spontaneous connection, that lit trouble, is missing for the libertine, he has to try and forge a connection through these intense, violent proxies.
Proxies for connection, like torture.
Yes. Beauvoir quotes Sade, saying his ultimate goal is to decisively break the carnal barriers that isolate consciousnesses. He can't reach the other person's inner world through empathy or desire, so he tries to violently penetrate their universe by inflicting extreme sensation, focusing on those moments of dissolution, of breakdown.
And he needs that reaction, doesn't he? That desperate performance of the victim's subjectivity. Beauvoir says he needs the victim to manifest her freedom in her cries or her prayers.
Yes, he's forcing the victim to prove their remaining freedom through their suffering, through their screams, which he then sort of consumes or witnesses as proof of his own power and, paradoxically, as proof of the victim's reality as a subject.
It's incredibly perverse.
It is. And Beauvoir identifies what she sees as a genuinely terrifying moment of, let's call it, existential success within this violence, a moment of horrifying attainment. She argues that when the victim finally utterly recognizes her fate as being bound to the tyrant's absolute unrestrained freedom, when she completely submits to his will, Beauvoir claims they become united with him by the tightest of bonds. They form a veritable couple.
A veritable couple, formed through total domination and submission. That is profoundly disturbing.
Yeah.
It almost sounds like it validates the idea that power can create intimacy, albeit a monstrous form of it.
It's a forced negative reciprocity. And she pushes it even further, suggesting that in the most intense of these scenarios, the torturer and the victim can ultimately recognize themselves as fellow creatures in astonishment, esteem, and indeed admiration.
Astonishment and esteem between torturer and victim.
Yes, that moment of mutual recognition born from sharing this absolute extremity becomes, in Beauvoir's reading, the twisted achievement of Sade's philosophical goal. It proves the other must exist as a subject capable of recognition for the tyrant's own project of absolute freedom to even register as successful, even if that success is momentary and built on destruction. It's the negative proof of intersubjectivity.
Okay, wow. So if the libertine is fundamentally striving for some kind of connection, even through destruction, and needs to recognize the other's capacity to suffer, does this also explain his really bizarre aesthetic tastes? His obsession with ugliness, filth, degradation, what Beauvoir calls villainy?
Absolutely. Why the constant focus on depravity, on the vile, the disgusting? Because for Sade, according to Beauvoir, beauty is too easy. Classical beauty can be grasped intellectually, admired from a safe distance. It allows consciousnesses to remain separate, untouched.
And the cerebral libertine is desperate to escape his own cerebrum, right?
Exactly. He wants to get beyond cool, detached appreciation. So the aesthetic of villainy, of wretchedness, becomes a tool, a philosophical and erotic tool to dissolve the tyranny of the conscious self.
How does that work?
By forcing the individual, both the perpetrator and the victim, to assume their carnality completely, to realize themselves not as minds observing, but as messy, uncontrollable, non-intellectual flesh. In that shared experience of wretchedness, humiliation, and mutual degradation, Beauvoir says the flesh becomes an abyss where the spirit is engulfed and where the separated individuals are rejoined.
So eroticism, channeled through villainy, becomes this extreme temporary solution for the isolated mind to find union by drowning together in the shared abyss of degraded flesh.
That's the idea. He's forcing the intellect to collapse into the body, using the most visceral, base aspects of existence as the meeting point, because higher forms of connection are closed off.
By embracing the absolute worst, the messiest parts of bodily existence, Sade is, in a way, trying to demonstrate that real existential connection is only possible when the mind completely fails, when its attempts to impose order and separation are overwhelmed.
It's a radical, disturbing path towards proving the inescapable reality of the body, and through that, the inescapable reality of the other.
Okay, this is where it gets, I think, really, really challenging for most people, myself included. If Sade's methods are, torture, murder, absolute tyranny, how can Beauvoir possibly justify calling him a great moralist or an ethical model? His actions are undeniably unethical by almost any standard, certainly by Beauvoir's own standard of respecting the freedom of others.
Right, and that's the absolute critical distinction we have to keep in mind. Beauvoir is not saying we should act like Sade's characters. That would be monstrous and completely against her own ethics. She isn't proposing a normative ethics based on Sade. Instead, she's evaluating Sade, the author, the thinker, the systematizer, as demonstrating what she calls an ethics of authenticity.
An ethics of authenticity. How does that differ from just regular ethics?
It's less about the content of the actions and more about the attitude towards one's own choices and condition. Sade, the writer, becomes an ethical model for her because he does precisely what the conventional serious man refuses to do. He confronts and assumes the ambiguity of the human condition pushed to its absolute extreme. He doesn't hide from his own anomalies, his own desires, however dark. He owns them. He takes his personal deviance, rationalizes it into a complete philosophical system, and then transforms it into a vast, structured literary work. He forces the union of flesh and spirit, thought and action within his chosen framework, however perverse the outcome.
So the ethical component here is the act of total, unblinking honesty about his own project. The fact that he follows his chosen path to its absolute logical conclusion without flinching, without hypocrisy.
Exactly. He refuses comfortable lies. He challenges society's most cherished values, family, religion, property, compassion, in the name of what he sees as concrete individual experience. And this act of systematic contestation, this rebellion expressed through literature, that is the ethical moment for Beauvoir. She uses this incredibly powerful analogy, comparing Sade's long imprisonment and his relentless writing during that time to an ethical night.
An ethical night. Parallel to Descartes' famous intellectual night. Okay, let's linger on that for a moment, because that's a really striking comparison. What's the parallel?
Well, you remember Descartes, right? In his famous meditations, he undertook an intellectual night where he systematically doubted everything he thought he knew, sense experience, mathematics, even the existence of the external world, until he reached the one bedrock certainty. Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. He had to tear down all the easy assumptions to find a solid foundation for knowledge.
Okay, yeah. Radical doubt to find truth.
Sade, Beauvoir argues, attempts something similar, but in the realm of morality. He systematically attacks and doubts all the too easy answers, all the inherited moral principles, all the comfortable societal values that people just accept without questioning. He doesn't necessarily arrive at a new, positive moral truth like Descartes' cogito. Instead, his value lies in the demolition work. By relentlessly unsettling established principles, by tearing down the bourgeois illusion that values are fixed, God-given, or absolute, he clears the ground.
Clears the ground for what?
For a truly authentic ethics, one that recognizes that values aren't found. They are created by free individuals who must take full responsibility for their choices in a fundamentally ambiguous world. Sade forces the reader, forces society to confront the terrifying possibility that morality isn't fixed, and that freedom includes the freedom to choose evil. He exposes the limits.
And beyond this philosophical function, his writing also had a very direct, very potent role as social criticism, right? Against the very society that locked him up for years without trial, using those notorious lettres de cachet.
Oh, absolutely. Sade's novels are like a dark, distorted mirror held up to the face of the ancient regime. He consistently depicts the aristocracy, noblemen, clergy, judges, powerful figures engaging in the most appalling debauchery, often specifically targeting and exploiting common people, servants, peasants, prostitutes.
So he wasn't just inventing cruelty out of thin air. He was exaggerating and exposing the actual systemic violence and hypocrisy he saw in the ruling class of his time, showing that maybe the powerful were already living out a version of the cruelty they publicly condemned.
Precisely. He drags the glaring inequalities and injustices of that society out into the harshest possible light. He becomes this unavoidable figure of contestation. And it's really significant, Beauvoir makes a point of this, that when Sade actually had a brief taste of political power during the French Revolution, he didn't become a tyrant.
Right, you mentioned that. He acted moderately.
Yeah, relatively speaking. He served as a judge, apparently rendered verdicts dismissing charges against accused counter-revolutionaries, and later in life, after Napoleon came to power and locked him up again, he apparently refused opportunities to take revenge on his mother-in-law and her family, who were largely responsible for his decades of imprisonment before the revolution.
That contrast is crucial, isn't it? Beauvoir notes he was actually discredited by his humanity during his political stint.
Exactly. It underlines her point. Sade's real ethical and philosophical power, for her, lies in the literary realm, in the imaginative destruction and questioning of norms and values. It's in the thought experiment pushed to its extreme, not in advocating for real-world violence. His ethics were a system of radical thought, a challenge, not a practical guide to behavior. And this brings us really to the absolute core of why Beauvoir felt compelled to write about Sade when she did. This essay, Must We Burn Sade, written right around the time the second sex was causing huge waves, functions as a crucial corrective and supplement to that landmark feminist work.
Okay, so she's explicitly using Sade, this incredibly problematic figure, to strengthen her feminist arguments. How does that work?
Well, remember the central problem diagnosed in the second sex. Woman is trapped in the role of the other, expected by society to be this passive, virtuous, perfect intermediary. She has to feign modesty, hide her own desires, and function as a prestigious object for male possession or definition.
Right, the myth of the eternal feminine.
Exactly. Sade's entire literary project, Beauvoir argues, is like a sledgehammer taken to that myth.
Oh.
It profoundly threatens the whole structure. And you see this most clearly in the contrast between his female characters. Think about Justine, the heroine of Justine, or the misfortunes of the virtue.
As a virtuous one.
The absolute paragon of feminine virtue. She tries desperately to adhere to every societal expectation of chastity, kindness, piety.
And the result, absolute unrelenting disaster. She's punished brutally, relentlessly, specifically because of her virtue.
Yes, and the sheer overwhelming repetition of torments inflicted on Justine for trying to be good becomes almost darkly comical in its absurdity. Beauvoir sees this as serving a vital critical function. It ruthlessly ridicules the societal worship of female passivity and chastity. It demonstrates in the most extreme way possible that trying to embody the ideal of the chaste, submissive other leads only to suffering and destruction. Virtue gets you nowhere in Sade's world, or perhaps Beauvoir implies, in the real world either, if you're a woman.
Okay, so Justine is the negative example. What about the positive ones? Or, well, positive in a Sadean sense.
Right, the villainous heroines. They become these figures of radical, albeit terrifying, female agency. Women like Juliet, Justine's sister, or the young Eugenie who gets educated in philosophy in the bedroom.
What do they represent?
They represent the complete opposite of Justine. They openly, aggressively, even philosophically affirm their own sexual desire. They're actively encouraged by the male libertines and by the logic of Sade's system to reject all the conventional moral values they were taught. They give themselves to the male in all possible ways, as Beauvoir puts it, but for their own pleasure. They don't just endure debauchery. They actively pursue it, enjoy it, orchestrate it. They're told explicitly to laugh reputation to scorn.
So they refuse shame.
Completely. And that act of affirmation is incredibly important because it directly confronts the patriarchal logic Beauvoir dismantled in the second sex. The logic that says female desire, if acknowledged at all, signals a loss of control, a shameful abdication of freedom. By owning their appetites, by refusing to be merely passive objects of male desire, these Sadean women assert control over their own flesh and subjectivity.
That definitely destabilizes the rigid gender roles she analyzed. So Sade's world, in its own twisted way, claims woman's sexual freedom is equal to man's, even if that freedom manifests as cruelty and vice.
Exactly. It posits a terrifying equality in transgression. If man can operate as an absolute subject of desire, pursuing his pleasure without limit, then a woman must, logically, be able to do the same. The system demands it.
And this plays out in those isolated castles and monasteries where his stories are often set.
Yes, those closed environments function like extreme philosophical laboratories. Inside them, a bizarre kind of equality is sometimes achieved. Gender roles become fluid, unstable. Heterosexuality certainly isn't the only norm. All forms of sexuality are explored. And crucially, women aren't just passive victims. They often fuck aggressively, tyrannously, and cruelly, to use the direct language scholars sometimes employ when discussing Beauvoir's analysis of Sade.
Beauvoir saw this aggression as necessary.
Potentially, yes. As perhaps a necessary, if brutal, intermediary stage towards shattering the old hierarchies. A way of demonstrating that women are capable of the same active will to power as men, even in its darkest forms. It's a dissolution of the traditional gender order in what some have called an infertility festival, a space removed from societal demands of reproduction and duty. It imagines gender roles freed from those constraints.
And this doesn't just empower the female characters, it also changes the portrayal of the male subject, right?
Yeah.
Compared to the second sex.
Yes, that's another key corrective function. In the second sex, the male subject often appears, culturally at least, as this confident, self-contained, transcendental norm. But Sade introduces this wanting male type, the libertine. His sexuality isn't portrayed as natural or self-sufficient. It's often described as abnormal, excessive, fundamentally dependent on extreme actions, on the victim's reaction, on external validation like the screen.
So the male subject is revealed as potentially fragile, incomplete, dependent too.
Precisely. It shatters the myth of the self-sufficient male norm and reveals his potential abnormality, his reliance on the other, undermining the entire traditional patriarchal setup, where man is the solid center and woman the fluctuating periphery.
Okay, so by staging this total upheaval of sexual norms, particularly around female desire and agency, Sade, within the confines of literature, performs this vital act of blowing up the patriarchal mystifications that Beauvoir wanted to dismantle.
That's exactly how Beauvoir uses him, and in doing so, she brings freedom back into direct connection with ethics, specifically feminist ethics, in a way that was perhaps less explicit after the more structural analysis of the second sex. Sade's relentless insistence, for example, that procreation is absolutely not the goal of sexual intercourse. You see this in his elaborate defenses of sodomy, of any non-reproductive sexual act. This reinforces the idea that sexuality is fundamentally a social fact. It's a mode of human interaction, of ethical or unethical existence, not just a biological function serving the species.
And by decoupling sex from reproduction so violently,
He clears the path, philosophically. He rips sexuality away from its traditional patriarchal justification, producing heirs, maintaining the family line, and throws it into the realm of pure individual choice and interaction. This literary act, however brutal, opens up the imaginative possibility that symmetry between the sexes can be restored, not through slow reform perhaps, but through a radical imaginative demolition of the oppressive structures that enforce asymmetry. Hashtag outro.
Okay. This has been, well, quite the journey into some very dark but intellectually stimulating territory. Let's try to synthesize this. It seems Sade performs two really critical, almost indispensable functions for Beauvoir, helping her push past certain limits in her own earlier thinking on ethics and feminism.
That's a good way to sum it up. First, there's the ontological function. Sade's philosophical project, particularly its failure to achieve pure isolatism, serves as a kind of negative proof. It demonstrates our radical, inescapable dependency on the other for our own subjectivity to even have meaning. His cruelty backfires, philosophically speaking, because it reveals that the tyrant needs the victim to be a free, feeling subject. So he fails in his quest for isolation, but in doing so, he helps define the necessary boundaries of intersubjectivity and therefore ethics.
Right. He shows us the necessity of the other by trying and failing to deny it absolutely. And the second function,
That's the social and feminist function. Sade provides the raw, explosive literary energy needed to just shatter patriarchal myths, especially the suffocating ideal of the eternal feminine. He allows Beauvoir to imagine, in the most extreme terms, what genuine sexual equality and freedom might look like, even if the path there in his books is paved with violence and transgression.
he gives women agency, even if it's the agency of the villain, making them equally capable of asserting their will, their desire, their cruelty.
Exactly. And what's so compelling, I think, is that Beauvoir seems to have recognized that she needed a figure like Sade, someone who went to the absolute limit, to fully articulate the boundaries of authentic freedom and the immense political power that can reside in transgression, even literary transgression.
Yeah, it's like she realized that the struggle for freedom isn't just about positive political action or building nice reciprocal relationships, although those are crucial. It can also be fought, and perhaps must sometimes be fought, through the radical imaginative overthrow of deeply ingrained societal norms, especially those enforcing gender inequality.
He takes that core existentialist dilemma, the tension between mind and body, freedom and situation, self and other, and pushes it to such an extreme that the underlying ethical framework becomes clearer precisely because he breaks it so completely. The breakdown illuminates the structure.
Which leaves us with a final, quite challenging thought for you, our listeners, to mull over. If Beauvoir is right, if exploring the absolute full range of human possibility, including the darkest impulses like radical cruelty, deviance, systematic destruction is necessary, even if only in thought experiments or literature, to truly understand the foundations of freedom and expose society's hypocrisies.
Then what uncomfortable truths, what dark corners of our own contemporary human experience, what radical challenges to our norms might we need to confront and understand today? What transgressions, perhaps even ones we find deeply disturbing, must we engage with critically if we want to build a truly robust, truly authentic ethics for our own complex times?